have a confession to make to you today. I have a problem. I don't like to wait. And have you identified with that? I don't like to call someone and be put on hold. I don't like to stand in line at a grocery store. I don't like to be behind an accelerator-challenged driver when the light turns green. I don't like pulling into a gas station and noticing all the pumps are already filled. I don't know why, but I couldn't wait to get through December this year and move into the opportunities for 2025. I wonder about you. How do you do with waiting? Just to kind of help you get in touch with your waiting, let me kind of set up a few scenarios for you and just see how you do with waiting, okay? Let's just say you're standing in line to purchase tickets, okay? And you've been there already for 20 minutes. The event is supposed to start in about 15, 20 minutes. And you get close to the ticket booth and you just notice that the person in front of you is having this long conversation with the cashier. And so, do you get excited because they're having such wonderful fellowship and you immediately want to say, hey, maybe we should start a small group? Or do you begin thinking about all the things you want to say to that cashier? Or you pretend you dropped something and as you pick it up, you bump into that person just to let them know that you're there waiting. How do you do with waiting? Or let's say you're in the waiting room at a doctor's office. You've already been there for over an hour, so what do? Are you so thankful that you finally get a chance to read the 2011 Time magazine or Health magazine that's there? Or do you tell all the other people in the waiting room that you've got this highly contagious disease so they just all quickly leave? Or do you make yourself hyperventilate so that you get immediate attention? How do you do with waiting? Or you're at a restaurant. Service is really slow. Are you grateful for the opportunity to work up an appetite? Or you make a vow that from now on you will never go to a restaurant unless it has a drive-through lane. That's the only kind you'll go to. How do you do with waiting? Now, those are kind of some casual kinds of waiting, but there are more serious kinds of waiting, aren't there? You're single. You thought by now God would have brought someone into your life, but it just seems like marriage isn't in the books for you. Or you're married. You've been praying for your spouse that they would change, and you've been praying and praying, but there's no evidence that any change is happening, and you're waiting. Or maybe you're like me. You've got a son or daughter. As a teenager, they walked away from the Lord. You've done everything you know to encourage them to come back to the Father, and yet today they seem more resistant to the things of God than they were when they were a teenager. That's hard waiting, isn't it? Maybe you're here this morning and this past year has been kind of filled with a sense of sadness, deep sadness. And every morning you wake up finally thinking, I'm going to finally live again, but that kind of a morning never seems to come. And so you're waiting. Maybe your experience has been like my mom. My mom passed away when she was 101. And she'd been waiting for 10 or 15 years to go home to be with God. She constantly wondered, why am I still here? So one time when I was out to visit her, she said, I guess I can't go home because God is still needing to discipline me or punish me for the many things that I have done. And I said to her, Mom, if your theology is right, I guess that means I'm going to live to I'm 130. And you've got a daughter-in-law who's going to live a long, 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 long time. That's just kidding. I'm getting some feedback here. Are you getting feedback? Are you okay? Anyway, maybe you're waiting. Those are more serious kinds of waiting, aren't they? They're much tougher than the casual kinds. You know, there is this strange thing for us who are followers of Jesus Christ. When we turn to the Bible and when we read about God who is all loving and we say, fantastic. We read about God who is all powerful. He can do anything we want. And we say, great. And yet this all powerful God keeps saying to his people in the very word that you and I hate so much, he keeps saying to us, wait. Psalm 27:4, wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord. Psalm 37:7, be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. In fact, in the scriptures over and again, you read about people waiting. God comes to Abraham. He's 75 years old, and God says, hey, Abe, guess what? You're going to have a baby. You're going to be the father of a great nation. And you know how long it took before he actually had that baby? 24 years. I would have thought after a couple of years, if I didn't see my wife, you know, I would have said, forget it. Having a baby is not in the cards for us. 24 years. God told the people they would be a great nation, and yet they waited 400 years in Egypt, another 40 years in the wilderness before that began to happen. Scripture suggests that at a very early age, Moses had this awareness that he was going to lead the people of Israel out of that land of Egypt. And yet it was 80 years after his birth that he finally went back to accomplish that particular destiny. The last time I had an opportunity to share with you, I shared with you Zach and Elizabeth's story. They prayed, they planted seeds, and they watered, and God never gave them the increase, if you kind of know what I mean. And then the angel shows up and tells Zach, hey, Zach, you're going to have a baby boy. And it was like Zach says, God, I don't believe you. And that's the thing about waiting, isn't it? It nibbles away at our faith. And when you and I have been praying for something and it actually happens, it's almost like we have a hard time believing that it's going to happen. We've just celebrated the birth of Jesus. Jesus came, healed, taught, did some awesome, wonderful things. For 3 years, the disciples waited for him to get his act together and bring in the kingdom. For 3 years, they waited for Jesus to get on with it, to right all wrongs. But instead of righting all wrongs, he got himself crucified. And then God brought Jesus from the dead. And what did Jesus say? Before he leaves, gives them one more command. And what's that command? Wait. Wait. And so they're in the upper room, and the Holy Spirit comes. Let's understand something about waiting, okay? If you're taking notes, the first observation, you and I need to understand that as followers of Jesus, waiting is the norm, not the exception. It's the norm, it's not the exception. In fact, 43 times in the Hebrew Scriptures, 43 times in the Older Testament alone, the people of God were commanded to wait. Waiting runs right through the entire Bible. It's part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. And some of you are probably sitting here thinking, oh, why? Why? Why does it have to be that way? Why does God have us wait? I mean, if it's true that God can do anything he wants, if it's true that God is for us, as Paul says in Romans chapter 8, if he is as loving as he says he is, then why doesn't he just kind of jump in and make things happen for us? I mean, you've wondered that, haven't you? Why doesn't he just jump in and make things happen so we don't have to wait 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 20 years, 30 years or more? Well, let me give you a second observation. And I really don't understand all of this, but people are much wiser than I am when it comes to the things of God. They said what's going on here is that what God is doing in us while we're waiting is as important, if not more important, than what we are waiting for. That what God is doing in us while we're waiting is more important than what we are waiting for. By the way, that sounds a lot like James 1, doesn't it? Dear brothers and sisters, whenever trouble comes your way, let it be an opportunity for joy, for when your faith is tested, and let's admit, waiting is a test of faith. So we could read this, for when your faith is tested through waiting, why should it be an opportunity for joy? Because your endurance has a chance to grow, so let it grow. for when your endurance is fully developed and you will be strong in character and ready for anything. In other words, while we're waiting for God to make things right, while we're responding to our circumstances, God is producing life-changing character qualities in us. And that is what waiting is all about. Which means we're going to have to learn to see waiting as an asset to our faith, rather than discipline or a punishment from God. We're going to have to learn to see waiting as important, let me just say it a little bit stronger, as essential to the growth and part of our faith. Now, this is tough for us, it is for me anyway, because we live in a culture that doesn't teach that. You and I, we live in an instant generation. We live in a culture that says it's all about finding quick relief from pain, anxiety, worry, or any other difficulty now. We live in a history and a time where we get what we want when we want it. It's like Dietrich Bonhoeffer put it, waiting is an art that our impatient age has forgotten. It wants to break open the ripe fruit when it's hardly finished planting the seed. But also often our greedy eyes are only deceived. The fruit that seems so precious is still green on the inside. You see, if you and I do not see waiting as a gift, if we are not okay with waiting, you and I will be tempted to throw away the fruit that God wants to produce in our lives. See, the bottom line is we can allow our waiting to push us away from God or to God. To or from. And I think I know you well enough to know that you do not want to short circuit what God wants to do in your life. And we as a church do not want to short circuit what God desires to do in our life as a church. We need to see waiting as an asset and allow it to shape us, so that we are then become amazed at what God is doing in us and through us. Like I said a couple of weeks ago with Zach and Elizabeth's story. I mean, they waited for years to have a baby. And what was their waiting all about? For Zach, it was a test of trust. That's what waiting does. It's a test. It's a test of our hearts. What do we really want? It's like author Pete Craig says, so I'm waiting for God. God is waiting for me to see if I come to him really wanting him and not just wanting things from him. And the bottom line is that's what waiting is all about. It's basically God saying to us, do you want me or you just want the things that I can give to you or do for you? Waiting, I suggest, is God testing our hearts so that we come to the place in our lives where we just want him. We want him, and so we intentionally pursue him to become like him. Well, let me make a third observation about waiting, because sometimes we get confused about this. You see, waiting is not doing nothing. Waiting is not passively hanging out. Eugene Peterson said it well. Waiting does not mean doing nothing. It means going about our assigned tasks, confident that God will provide the meaning and the conclusions. It means a confident and alert expectation that God will do what he said he will do. Unfortunately, too many followers of Jesus Christ really don't understand this. I mean, they just don't get it. And you probably know some people like this who use this as an excuse for not taking appropriate action, for not owning up to their responsibility. I mean, you probably know people, and hopefully this isn't your spouse, okay? You probably know people who spend money like crazy, okay? And the way they get way over their head, and rather than taking responsible action, they say, well, we're just waiting on God to provide for us. So that's not biblical waiting, folks. Biblical waiting is not sitting around waiting for this letter that says you've crossed goal. Collect $200. That kind of thing fits the theological category of don't be stupid, okay? Waiting using the money illustration means going maybe to a seminar, learning and applying some biblical principles on finances and stewardship. Waiting is not passive. It's not a way to try and avoid responsibility and reality. Quoting Peterson again, it means going about our assigned tasks, Confident that God will provide the meaning and conclusion. It means a confident and alert expectation that God will do what he said he would do. In other words, it's that continual daily decision where I will say, God, I will trust you. And as I trust you, I will obey, even though the circumstances of my life right now are not the way I planned it, not the way I would like it to be. But God, I am just betting everything on you. I'm convinced that you will provide the meaning and the conclusions. So I will obey. And God, I want you to know there is no plan B. I'm going with you all the way. You know, back in the second half of 1970s, I pastored a church in Brandon, Manitoba. While I was there, I had the privilege of officiating at a young couple's wedding. Over the next couple of years, they ran into some problems. They actually had 2 children. Unfortunately, ran into some problems. She left and divorced her husband. Now in their early teens, his 2 daughters came to him one day and said, Dad, you're still wearing your wedding ring. It's been years now. Don't you think it's about time to take it off? Come on, Dad, your marriage is over. And you know what he said to his daughters who were not walking with the Lord? He said, you know, when I married your mom, I made a promise. I made a promise that I would love your mom and remain faithful to her until death do us part, and nothing, absolutely nothing has changed. He said for him, there were no options, no plan B. Now, by the way, in sharing that illustration, I'm not saying that's for everybody, okay? Please do not hear me saying that that is the only option for every situation or maybe your situation. But for him, he was going with God no matter what. It didn't matter how long it was going to be. He was going with what he had promised for God no matter what. Was it easy? Of course not. It wasn't easy for him. And by the way, eventually she came back like the prodigal son, and they did get remarried. You and I know this is not easy. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but most of the power of God in the Bible was given so that people could get through their suffering, not avoid it. You ever notice that? Most of the power in the Bible was given to people who could persevere in their situation and not avoid their situation. It means learning to wait, which is so important. So let me just take a couple minutes here to talk about what is it going to wait for you and me to practice biblical waiting? When God is not in a hurry. What needs to be part of my life? What needs to be part of your life as a follower of Jesus Christ? Let me just share 3 things with you. Waiting on the Lord requires patient trust. Patient trust. You see, will I trust that God has a good reason for having me wait? I may not know what that reason is. But will I trust that God knows what he's doing and I'm therefore okay with it? Will I remember that he sees these things from a very different perspective than I do? And so will I trust him? The writer of 2 Peter helps us understand this when he writes 2 Peter 3, but you must not forget, dear friends, that a day is like 1,000 years to the Lord, and 1,000 years like a day. The Lord isn't really slow about his promise to return, as some people think. No, he's being patient for your sake. In other words, he has a very different perspective than maybe you and I. Some of you may have heard the story about this economist who was reading this passage, 2 Peter 3, and was quite amazed by what he's reading. And so he said, God, is it really true that 1,000 years is just kind of like a minute to you? And God said, yeah, that's what it means. Well, that must mean that $1 million is just kind of like a penny to you. And God said, yeah. Well, then, God, could you just give me a penny? And God says, sure, wait a minute. A few of you got that. We smile. But isn't it true that we often want God's resources, but we don't necessarily like his timing? Listen, think about it. It shouldn't be that difficult, should it? I mean, if God is who he is, all-knowing, all-powerful, loving, and the Bible affirms for us that God is for us. If God is who he is, as we read from Isaiah chapter 40, then trusting him should not be that difficult, should it? And yet, if you're like me, when you're waiting, the longer you wait, the harder it gets, isn't it? But trust must patiently wait. Being confident that God will provide the meaning and the conclusions is living with that alert expectation that God will do what he said he would do. I don't know, maybe for some of you here this morning, 2024, you had a dream of making a difference in some particular area of your life. You had this dream about what you wanted to accomplish, where you live, where you work, but for some reason, and you don't understand it, but for some reason, it never happens. And so you're living with a sense of disappointment, maybe hurt. Maybe in the past couple of weeks, you've been tempted to try to force things, manipulate, scheme. You've been tempted to use people to try to make it happen. Or maybe you've just been tempted to kind of give up altogether, give up the potential that God has given you. You're being tempted to go kind of into cruise control and just kind of drift through the next part of your life. Listen, I'm asking you this morning, will you have the patience to not force it or quit and just wait patiently for God? To trust that what God is up to is exactly what you need right now? Maybe you'd like to see some significant change in some area of your life. Maybe it's your marriage. I mean, you really would love things to be different, and you're being severely tempted to either emotionally kind of bail out or maybe even physically, because it's not happening as fast as you think it should. Will you wait? You're here this morning and you're a teenager, and your parents, sometimes they're so disgusting, aren't they? I mean, from your perspective, they are just so out of touch, and so you're tempted to shut your parents out of your life. You come home from school, you go to your room, you come back, you get a bite to eat, you go back to your room, and you're tempted to kind of give up trying to communicate with your mom and dad. Hey, will you be patient? Will you trust God? Will you continue to engage with your mom and dad, believing that God is doing exactly what you need right now? Waiting requires patient trust. Waiting also requires confident humility. Confident humility. Hey, there's something very humbling about waiting, isn't there? Because when I'm waiting, what's that mean? That means that I am not in control. While I'm waiting, I'm very much aware that I am not running the show. I'm not calling the shots. I mean, I can yell and I can scream, but it's not going to change anything. And that's why I say waiting requires humility. And by the way, if you haven't figured this one out yet, you will soon. In our society, there's a direct relationship between our status in our society and waiting. I mean, the higher your status, the less you have to wait. The lower your status, the longer you have to wait, right? I mean, that's just the way it works in our society. If you've been to a doctor's office lately, you will know what I'm talking about. You go to the doctor's office, and what's the first room you come to? You come to a waiting room. And I have yet to see a doctor in the waiting room waiting to see one of his patients. Doesn't work that way, does it? Why? Because the doctor's in charge, not the patient. Waiting reminds me that I am not in charge, and it requires humility. Waiting on the Lord requires inextinguishable hope. Let me take you to some very, very familiar words from the prophet Isaiah. Probably a lot of you know these words from memory. And they flow from our lips very easily, very quickly, but I'm not always sure we've done a great job in working them out into our lives. So let me take a few moments just kind of unpack those familiar words. Those who hope in the Lord, or we could say those who wait on the Lord, they will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not faint. Let's just explore that for a couple of minutes. Isaiah says sometimes when you wait on the Lord, sometimes when you hope in the Lord, you're going to soar as wings on wings as eagles. I mean, you've seen eagles soar, right? I mean, an incredible picture. Birds sometimes flap. Birds sometimes glide. But sometimes birds soar. And the prophet Isaiah says, for those who hope in the Lord, those that wait in the Lord, there will be times in their life where they will soar. And some of you, I'm sure you're soaring these days. 2024 has been a fantastic year for you spiritually. Spiritually, you're having the time of your life. You have never been so on top of things. You pray, and God just keeps answering one prayer after another. You read your Bible, and you see things there that you have never, ever seen before. You've got wisdom for different situations, and you don't know where did that wisdom come from. And certain temptations, which had bothered you for a long time, now they have no power in your life anymore. You have no fear when it comes to sharing Jesus with others. And you've got energy for life and for service, and you've got strength, and you're optimistic about the future, and life for you could not be better right now. And I want to say to you, if you're soaring right now, hey, enjoy. Enjoy to the fullest. Keep on doing the kind of things you need to stay in the rising currents of God's power. Continue to be obedient to the Spirit. Keep praying, keep obeying, keep practicing those things, those disciplines that allow you to catch the currents of the Spirit of God in your life. If you're soaring, hey, enjoy it. Isaiah adds a second line, because some of us may not be soaring and we're running, and we're not growing weary. You're not soaring, you're just kind of running. You're not really having a lot of fun right now, but you are determined to keep on running. You're not having a lot of fun, but you're going to keep on going. You love to see more of God's work in your life as a result of the running, but there's enough there to keep you in it. There's enough feeling of God's pleasure, so you keep on running. If that describes you this morning, let me just say, yeah, keep running. Keep running. Faithfully serving and praying and obeying and loving and sharing and giving. And don't compare yourself to someone who is perhaps soaring right now. Your time will come. Just keep running, because when you run, what happens? Your muscles get real strong. That's why you need to keep running. But Isaiah adds a third line, and this may be some of us here this morning. We're not soaring. We're not running. We're just walking. Maybe it's because of doubt. Maybe it's because of some pain, some disappointment. Maybe you're just tired. Maybe it's because of some regret of something that happened in 2024. Maybe it relates to some failure, and we're plagued by a sense of shame and condemnation, and so all we can do is really walk and not faint and not keel over. We don't see a lot of fruit coming out of our lives. There's nothing really productive that seems to be happening. We don't feel triumphant, and maybe you've been hurt. You've been wounded. You've suffered loss. Maybe you're confused about a lot of stuff that's going on right now. And walking is about all you can do. It's all you have to offer God. Let me say to those of us who find ourselves in group 3, the waiting group, listen carefully. God understands. You see, you need to understand Jesus knows what it's like to walk and not faint. He knows what it's like to be in this group. He understands what walking is all about. Yet there were times when Jesus soared. I suggest you at his baptism, he soared when he heard that voice from heaven, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I delight." That was a time of soaring. On the Mount of Transfiguration, I'm sure he soared. When Lazarus came out of that grave, I'm sure Jesus soared. But I suggest you, he did not always soar. There are times where he faced some very serious obstacles, and yet he just kept running. There are times when he faced the indifference of the city of Jerusalem, and he just wept. And you remember how frustrated he was, how often he was frustrated because the disciples were so slow, so faith-challenged. I suggest you, those were not soaring days for Jesus. Those are probably more walking days. And then there are the religious teachers who kind of just fought him every step of the way. I think those were days where Jesus just wasn't soaring, but he just kept running to do the Father's will in spite of the circumstances that he found himself in. But I suggest to you there were days when all he could do was walk. When he went to pray in the Garden of Gethsemane, he said to his disciples, "My soul is crushed." He was walking, crushed. Grief to the point of death. Drops of blood as he prayed. God, isn't there another way? When they insisted he carry his own cross on his bruised and beaten, bleeding body, he wasn't running that day. In fact, on that day, you remember, he stumbled and he fell. But he got up, kept on walking, because that's all he could do was walk. Sometimes you and I find ourselves in situations where all we can do is walk. And maybe 2024 was one of those years for you. I mean, you're not excited about it, but the stuff of life has just hit you hard. And all you can really do is walk. We're not excited about it, but the stuff of life is difficult. Listen, if that's where you are this morning, let me just say, thank God that walking is enough. Thank God that walking is enough. In fact, I think maybe when life is the hardest and we just want to quit so badly, when we get no support from our feelings and from our emotions, when everything within us is saying, hey, you've had enough, you've waited too long, when we say to God, God, I will not quit, no matter what. I will just keep putting one foot forward after another, and I'll just keep following you. And when the road seems the hardest, I think God takes the greatest pride in our walking, even more than when we're running and soaring. Do you know why? Because what God is happening, what God is doing in us, is far more important than what we might be waiting for. And so my encouragement to you is just keep walking. Keep putting one foot forward and then another. Because someday you're going to soar. Someday you're going to soar again. Maybe it's not going to be 2025, I don't know. But I know that someday you're going to soar again. Not on earth, but the promise is you're going to soar, and you will realize like you have never known before, that it has been worth it. No, not that it has been worth it. He has been worth it. And you will know beyond a shadow of a doubt, he has been worth the wait. So let me encourage you, if you're in that third group, keep walking, keep trusting, keep loving, keep caring, keep sharing, keep giving. Because the promise of God is you will not faint. You will not faint. Can we get this? Can we hang on to this? God is pleased by our walking. God is pleased by our walking because in our walking we're saying, God, I am going to go with you all the way. I am not going to bail out. I will not quit going your way. I don't understand a lot of what's going on in my life, but I will keep on walking and knowing that what I am going through is exactly what we need right now. Is it easy? No, it's not easy. So here's what we're going to do this morning. I'm going to invite the worship team to come forward at this time. As you're coming forward, I don't know what your specific situation is, but maybe you're here today and you're walking and you realize you need prayer. You need hope, maybe encouragement, strength to persevere, power, healing from some hurt or disappointment. I don't know what it might be for you, but you need prayer. So what I'm going to do is, while we are singing, I'm going to invite you to come down and meet me at the front here. And as the congregation is worshiping, we'll just pray together. And we'll just ask God to minister to us in a special way. You see, I can't promise you a miracle, but I can promise you how the message paraphrased Isaiah 40. God doesn't come and go. God lasts. He's creator of all you can see or imagine. He doesn't get tired out, doesn't pause to catch his breath, and he knows everything inside and out. He energizes those who get tired, gives fresh strength to dropouts, for even young people tire and drop out. Young folk in their prime stumble and fall, but those who wait upon the Lord get fresh strength. They spread their wings, they soar like eagles, they run, they don't get tired, and they walk, and they don't lag behind. So if you find yourself walking today, not soaring, not running, kind of lagging behind, it's kind of hitting you hard these days. Spiritually speaking, you really can't do anything more than walk while your church family is worshiping. Why don't you come and join me down the bottom here, and we'll just pray as the congregation sings, and then you can go back to your seats. Worship team, lead us.